All right. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be here. And I think this presentation, please feel free to interrupt at any point, ask me questions, and I can elaborate on any of the topics as we go on this bit of my story in terms of learning about why the shift from project to product is so important in terms of elevating the work that you're already doing. My own history, and this is that decade where Agile really came into play. This is basically between 2000 and 2010. I was developing software, and my team at Xerox PARC had just started adopting Agile methodologies through extreme programming. We were basically doing that by the book. We were doing continuous delivery, and we were having a great time. We were writing a lot of interesting code, creating a new programming language that then got more widely adopted and injected into other programming languages. And through this, I learned what it's like to be working with a highly effective, high-velocity team. Then I decided, I actually then had some problems in terms of my own personal career because I was working such long hours. I developed a repetitive stress injury, RSI, in my arms. And I started looking at why this was happening. Why was I actually getting physically injured from writing code? This didn't really make sense to me. And I realized that by inspecting the work that I was doing, that the way I had become disconnected from what we now call the value stream, from this flow of information that prioritizes and drives our work, was making me thrash constantly between different windows on my desktop, issue trackers, email, meeting notes, tickets, and the code, and so on. And so I decided to do my research in this. I did a PhD in this, in how to connect developers to the value stream. And I started studying professional developers, started studying open source developers, and I realized that we could actually double their productivity by streamlining all of this, by changing the architecture of the code and the way we work to be aligned to this flow of business value, the way we deliver features and fixes and so on. And then I started studying and working more closely with large organizations. So what we did to do that is my PhD supervisor and I, Gail Murphy, we founded Tasktop and started adopting some of these technologies that we had learned in open source to large enterprise settings. And then I realized that there was this much bigger problem at play. It wasn't just individual developers were thrashing, teams were thrashing. Large organizations were basically thrashing at this very significant level in terms of their own productivity around software delivery. So we started noticing these strange things. Developers were constantly context switching between different projects, and teams were switching, and programs were changing. And what I was seeing as the productivity in enterprise organizations was 100th, maybe 1,000th what I'd experienced in working in highly effective open source, highly effective tech companies. So throughout this, I was working and meeting with more and more organizations, traveling the world increasingly. This has really been the last decade, and watching these very large Agile and DevOps transformations basically either fail or not deliver results that anyone would really stake their careers on. And I realized that we needed a new way of thinking and a new way of structuring the way that we manage and we track and measure software delivery so we could know whether something we're doing is actually improving things or whether it's not. And so that we could align the flow of value through software in organizations in a sort of new operating model. And that's where the Flow Framework came from. So I'll tell you about the Flow Framework today, and I'll give you an overview of some of the key themes of this book, Project to Product. So the first story for me was the story of Nokia. I think for many of us working in Agile, this is a familiar story because this company basically was one of the first large adoptions of Agile methodologies. Back in 2006, they realized that there was a change coming, there was a disruption coming, and that Apple had gotten hold of a large glass capacitive touch screen, and that the mobile experience was going to change. That it was now going to be software driven, and you needed to write a lot more software and move much faster with software. It wasn't enough to have these nice shiny buttons on the phone anymore. You needed a more digital experience. And so they realized that software, before any of us learned about the iPhone, by the way, they realized that software would be their bottleneck because they needed to build a lot more of it. Back then they had the Symbian Series 40 operating system. And so they took this Agile transformation very seriously back in 2007. They brought in the best consultants. They brought in Ken Schwaber, the father of Scrum. They brought in Dean Leffingwell, the father of the Scaled Agile framework. And they started training everyone on Scrum and adopting the best tools out there. But I was working with them at the time, and what I was realizing is that the way that they were approaching this agile transformation and the way they were tracking it was just completely off to me, because I was working with development managers and developers and helping them adopt our open source and our new commercial technologies. And while they were basically thinking they were the poster child of Agile, and the consultants helping them, and all the contractors helping them, thought that they were calling Nokia this poster child of Agile. So you'd go to a conference, you'd see Nokia as definitive proof that Agile scales. Meanwhile, what was happening internally is that Agile was not really their problem. The problem the developers were facing, they thought the tools were nice, the training was good, nothing was helping, because their problem was actually the software architecture of the Symbian operating system. So this software architecture could not deliver the kind of features that the company needed. And developers were just being asked to deliver more and more features, never had a chance to invest in fixing the architecture. The Agile deployment was a local optimization of the value stream, which means they weren't delivering more value faster, they were just being Agile in the middle. And the net result of this was that they did not move faster sufficiently, and they lost the entire mobile market they created. More than half of the world's devices were Symbian and Nokia. Now that's basically 99% of that value evaporated over the following decade. So we're seeing these things happen over and over now, and we're seeing them increase. And I realized that what had happened at Nokia was the problem was not that they didn't want to transform, that they were looking at the transformation and measuring it the wrong way. Their measurement was how many people are trained on Agile and how many people are adopting the tool chain. These became the Nokia test for agility. It's created by the Nokia and Siemens networks. And the entire time they thought they were on track, but they were measuring the wrong things. So at a business level, the technologists, by the way, knew they were off track. There was no question. It just at a business level, they thought they were on track and that everything was working because they were measuring the wrong things. So here's another story, and this is a similar one, but this is now a decade later. So this is a top 25 bank. This is now their third Agile transformation. And I kind of watched two happen. This time it's with DevOps, so it was, I think, on better footing, but I think that alone, it turns out, is not enough. And this is what's so interesting about this, because for me, the way these problems happen at scale is just fascinating. This is tens of thousands of IT staff and a budget of over $1 billion. So in addition to the IT budget. So it's very consequential, very important. This company realizes the Nokia story. They realize the importance of disruption. That's not the question. Nokia realized how important innovation was, that they would be disrupted. And what I'm seeing now is that, again, a little bit like Nokia, the completely wrong things are being measured. So we're seeing project management is the way that the business is measuring the success of this transformation. It is this layer between the technology and the business, between IT and the business. And then 2 years later, this now concludes. It's a successful transformation by the way it was measured. And there's only two ways it was measured. It was measured through cost reduction. So what was the end result of cost reduction? And through the project plans, where all the activities and milestones hit. And the consensus is, as I'm talking to the leaders behind this transformation, some of whom have since left the bank, unsurprisingly, is that IT is delivering to the business even less than it was delivering before. So $1 billion spent, again, all the right intentions, a lot of really smart people wanting to do the right thing for their business, but IT is now delivering less than it was before. And it just struck me that there was this organization, like Nokia, had no measure of value. They did not know if something that they were doing was actually delivering more business value through software or less. They were just tracking activities through project plans, and they were tracking what the cost effects were. So there's this layer of indirection between the business and IT, and again, that lack of visibility completely destroyed the direction of this transformation. And I realized from this that project management, a way of tracking activities, and cost centers are just the wrong model in terms of trying to become a software innovator. And that these kinds of proxy metrics, again, will completely lead organizations astray. And this is turning out to be a pretty serious thing now, right? As we saw Rick give some examples earlier, some of these organizations have actually figured it out, right? You've got Amazon This is the stock price change of Amazon over the decade ending in 2016, and the stock price change of other retailers. So Amazon is a company who has aligned its product value streams with its organizational structure and its software architecture. So things like microservices and containers to pizza teams and so on, right? These things are aligned. And by doing so, they've been able to basically create a disruption machine, right? It's not just an e-commerce platform, it is a disruption machine because they can innovate so quickly around software, they can move into markets of their choosing. These other companies, each of them, they've heard all the disruption stories as well. They've been trying to go through these transformations, and they're just not doing it successfully. And so again, there's something fundamentally wrong because the desire is there, the budgets are there, the need is there. And at the current rate of change, the growth of companies who have figured this out, the companies who have mastered software delivery, who can manage billion-line code bases at an organization level, at a company management level, is shifting so fast that in the US, half of the S&P 500, one of the main stock indices, half of those companies is projected to be replaced over the next decade. We've got a similar statistic with the FTSE as well in the UK. So, and it's actually getting quite interesting because it's not just retail anymore, right? Even, interestingly, banks don't appear to be immune from this. So they still appear somewhat immune, but they might not be immune, right? Technology companies now need to keep growing. The tech giants need to keep growing. So they'll go after banks. They'll go after other types of businesses. And this, to me, was just a fascinating report that came out in June. Banks have spent, to date, approximately, according to this report, $1 trillion on digital transformation. So again, I think that fear of disruption, that need to act, they're aware of this. But the results are not measurable. So $1 trillion, that's 1 or 2% of the entire world economy. That much wealth has gone into this, and it's unclear if it's producing the right kind of results. While these other tech giants are just innovating faster and faster. So again, I think we've got a pretty fundamental problem here in the way these organizations are looking at and measuring this. And I got to wondering, in sort of the early days of writing Project to Product, and I actually, what triggered me to write Project to Product is actually leaving that one bank I gave you the story of and thinking, wow, like I just saw $1 billion, because I knew this was happening was going to happen 2 years before, and I told my colleagues, I actually wrote it up in a note. This bank's transformation is going to go completely off the rails, and they won't know it for 2 years. Exactly that happened. I thought, okay, this is not okay. This is, to have $1 billion of the world's wealth go up in flames is while the rest flows to the tech giants is not a great and healthy thing for the world. So I got to wondering, has this kind of shift happened before? And Jean Kim introduced me to the work of Dr. Claudia Perez around this time. She wrote this fascinating book called Technological Revolutions in Financial Capital. She published it in 2002. She's now at the London School of Economics. And in this book, she outlines these 5 different waves, these kind of macroeconomic, you can call them Kondratiev waves, sort of similar to that, starting 250 years ago with the Industrial Revolution, moving to the age of steam and railways, age of steel and heavy engineering, age of oil and mass production, and now the age of software. And you can slice and dice these slightly differently, but the key thing is that these happen around every 50 years, and each of them is triggered by some new means of production becoming cheap and very valuable. So think of the way that railways basically displaced other modes of transportation. Think of the way that cars and mass production and oil completely transformed the world. Now, the fascinating thing about Dr. Perez's model for each of these revolutions, and she says we've gone through 4 and we're halfway through the 5th, is that she breaks these revolutions up into 3 distinct periods. There's the installation period, and that's when this new thing comes, right? That's when electricity is mastered and it starts getting used everywhere. That's where just over 100 years ago in Detroit, Henry Ford started mastering mass production, right? And started being able to make not just bespoke cars, but produce cars. And within a decade, basically, they were already replacing horse-drawn carriages. And what's so interesting that as soon as that happens, all of the financial capital, all of the people who want to make a 10x return off something now start funding, or a portion of them, start funding that new means of production. So there's this frenzy of innovation and invention. In Detroit alone, where Henry Ford was, there were over 300 car startups at this point, none of which we would recognize the names of anymore, because there's this frenzy of startups and innovation. And this happens over and over. And it's something that was really interesting because I never expected that. I thought we were special in terms of technology. And then there's this turning point that happens where some companies master production at scale when lean manufacturing started coming about a century ago. So you go from the spirit of creative destruction to this turning point where some companies, again, have gotten very good at scaling production, and they start amassing massive amounts of capital. So I think we know who these companies are today, right? It's the FANGs and Microsoft. It's the BATs, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent in China. They only exist in the US and China, where the capital's been flooding and funding these companies. And they've become so good, so good at mastering technology and software that their combined wealth is the size of Japan's economy. So today, they are collectively the third largest economy in the world. And they're going to continue growing. Interestingly, Dr. Perez also notes that with every one of these revolutions, society starts slowly waking up to the impact of these new robber barons, these new companies around the time of the turning point, somewhere through the turning point, and regulation does kick in. So now it's feeling quite a bit different than 10 years ago. But these companies, Europe is stronger in regulation with things like GDPR than the US and China, but these companies are in the US and China. And so I don't think the regulation is going to slow them down to the point where the disruption will slow down substantially over at least the next decade. But what has happened in every other age is that there's this deployment period that kicks in, where, first of all, the financial capital slows down because the production capital becomes so strong. But other parts of the economy, other companies learn how to take that means of production, and it gets diffused, it gets disseminated across the economy. So other companies learn, in this case, how to do mass production. Last wave, how to do mass production. In this one, other companies need to learn how to become software innovators. So the question really becomes, how do we take your organization, organizations that you support, and bring them into this deployment period? Where again, in past waves, we've seen companies learn how to master this new means of production. We actually have seen inequality decrease through the deployment period. Because again, the wealth concentration starts getting dispersed. And it really is a question of learning, what have these companies learned, how do they approach software delivery, and how do you need to think differently to make sure that your company pulls through this turning point, and we actually get this period of wealth generation that Dr. Carolina Perez has called these the golden ages. And what she also mentions in her work and studies is that each of these waves has come with a new managerial approach, right? There's been factory systems, subcontracting. Taylorism was mastered with the age of steel and heavy engineering, right? It's where we learn how to make large buildings and large bridges. It's where we learn how to treat people as mindless cogs in a machine and move them from project to project and assign them and reassign them and so on. And what Henry Ford realized with the advent of what we now call Fordism is that that doesn't actually work for something as complex as mass production, right? It's not as simple as having contractors build a building or a bridge. It's something that requires a lot of training, requires andon cords to be pulled, and so on. So we got Fordism and investing more in our employees through Fordism. But what I realized while working with all these organizations is that the way that enterprise IT companies are actually managing IT and innovation is through Fordism, is through project management. And so there's, how can we possibly expect something that didn't even work for mass production, for building the amazing cars that we have today, to work for managing innovation in technology? So to understand this better, I went and visited one of our largest customers because this organization, BMW Group, they actually did make it through the last turning point, right? They're one of the brands that we do recognize. They're like the Fords and GMs and Daimlers and so on. And I want to understand not just how they did lean manufacturing, but how at a business level they actually thought about production. And to contrast, how is that different than the IT leaders, the CIOs, the chief digital officers, and chief transformation officers I was working with, how that was different than the way they thought about production in software. And so I visited, for 2 days, the Leipzig plant. This is the BMW's flagship plant where they made what's so interesting about this plant is that the i3 and i8, their response to the disruption of Tesla, are produced there. And we started working with them as part of those programs to help with the software delivery in those cars because they have so much software. And what was so fascinating to me was the way that the lean principles were embodied in this plant, but in the culture of the plant, in the metrics, in the dashboards, and everything. The lean principles, which in the end underpin Agile, underpin DevOps, as summarized by Jim Womack, are precisely specify value by product, identify the value stream for each product, make value flow without interruptions, and let the customer pull value from the producer. So this is not about activities, this is not about proxies, this is about these end-to-end, customer-focused value streams and how you connect them and measure flow. And this was throughout the plant. Even the architecture of the buildings is all around what the value streams are. So up top there, you actually see the 1 and 2 series value streams, right? This is how BMW helps make their revenue numbers, their top line. This assembly line is extremely long. It winds. It's got the shape of a hand, a sideways hand, basically. It's made for extensibility. They can extend those buildings to add different production steps. So it needs to be extensible, and it's high velocity, high volume. So every manufacturing step takes 70 seconds. Almost 900 cars roll off that line, drive off that line every day. What was so surprising to me was that the i8, that cool car at the start of the presentation, that line is only the width of this building. So it's a tiny fraction of the length of the 1 and 2 series lines. And it's because that car was not about hitting the top line. That car was about learning. That car was about the value stream was about BMW learning how to build electric cars. Each manufacturing step took half an hour. And it was a bunch of generalists, rather than these very specialized 70-second steps that made the car. And so the business goals of each value streams are understood, and each of the value streams were structured to those business goals. And I got to thinking how different this is than what I was seeing in enterprise IT. So in car production, or in now modern car production, everything is around these integrated end-to-end production lines, right? You don't ever obsess about one step. You don't ever obsess about how long it takes to go and close the user story. You're always taking the customer perspective of the end-to-end time. And if there's a problem with how long one step takes, then you worry about that step. Whereas in enterprise IT, we have these disconnected tool chains, we have these silos. In car production, everything is managed and structured as products. Right? Products are long-lived. Products are things that you support for a long time. Products are things that your organization, your staff needs to master and needs to be passionate about. Whereas in enterprise IT, everything I was seeing was managed as projects, as a set of activities, and that had no clear end, and this notion of outsourcing them to lower cost regions was a key part of this, rather than, again, this notion of long-lived products. Everything at the plant and in modern car production is architected around flow. So this notion of a single enterprise architecture that will meet every single need and be perfectly modular, which to me was the way I thought about architecture because my PhD was actually in software architecture, that was completely foreign, right? You actually optimize the architecture for each product value stream. And the architecture of the i8, i3, and 1 and 2 series are very different. And because their goals are very different. Everything was optimized end to end. BMW knows that the lead time, the time it takes from, every car manufacturer knows this, from customer order to customer car delivery is the #1 predictor of company performance in terms of the manufacturing. Whereas everything I was seeing, all the metrics, whenever I asked a CIO, whenever I asked an IT leader, what metrics are you using? They were all these silo metrics, these things measuring a portion of the value stream. How advanced, how trained are we on Scrum? What's our safe deployment? How many automated tests do we have? How many deploys per day are we doing? Those are all relevant metrics if that's where the problem is. They're not relevant. They're only relevant, though, if that's your constraint. If you're not measuring end to end, you don't even know where your constraint is. Whereas, again, at BMW, everything was a function of managing business results. Now, I was also learning that cars are different than software. And part of the problems that we have is that software is hard to see. Cars are very easy to see. Quality problems at the BMW Leipzig plant are very obvious for executives to notice because they count the cars in the rework area. And that's how many quality problems you have because the cars are expensive enough, every one of them gets finished. So business value flow at the BMW plant is really all about delivering those cars that have sheer driving pleasure. But the cars are designed in yearly cycles, right? They're designed in Munich and elsewhere. They're delivered every 70 seconds in Leipzig. And so the creative and the manufacturing process are actually two separate things. And the flows are across this linear production line. The manufacturing flows are across this linear production line. And I started realizing, and it's kind of one of the epiphanies in the book, that we try to make DevOps feel that way. It's not. It's not linear, right? It's not this manufacturing process. Because if you think about the way that business value flows in your company, if you imagine your IT organization, how you deliver value to your customer or to internal stakeholders, it's around these very different things that flow, right? It's around new features that success and delight your end users, your customers. But they're not delivered in annual cycles anymore. If they are, you've got a bigger problem. They're designed and delivered in daily cycles now, or weekly cycles in every sprint. And so the creative and the manufacturing process are actually one. And we visualize this by looking at our customers' value stream data. And we can see that it's not this linear production line. It's actually this value stream network of information flowing and being created between developers, designers, testers, infrastructure staff. And it's flowing across this network whenever we visualize it. It looked more like an airline network than it looked like a production line. And so I got to thinking, is that in terms of us getting on the same page, the IT people, the business side getting on the same page in terms of how you measure value, we actually have to define what flows through those software value streams. And so the key question that the flow framework answers is what flows in software delivery. And it introduces just 4 flow items. The whole goal is having this simple language that takes what we've learned in Agile, what we've learned in DevOps, what we've learned in frameworks that you saw, like LeSS, like SAFe, and DevOps practices, and elevating those to a simple common language that the business and the technology side can agree on as a measure of productivity. So there are 4 flow items. Features, those are new business value that you deliver to your customers. They're pulled by the customer. And remember, these flow items are unlike the work items in an Agile framework. You might have 30, 40, 80 different work item types defined in your Agile tool. These are all around the customer's perception of value, not around the activities of creating those. Now, the whole SAFe Agile framework, by the way, will map into the flow framework. Dean Leffing will announce that last week at the Global SAFe Summit in SAFe 5.0. Defects. So defects are, as we've learned, the faster you can fix defects in software, the better your customer's experience. And it's no longer a question of whether there are. For a tech giant, the focus has shifted from mean time to failure, which is not releasing any defects, to mean time to repair, which is how quickly you resolve them. So the faster the flow of defect, the more successful the tech company tends to be. Risks, those are now a first-class part of software delivery. So implementing regulations such as GDPR, data privacy, security, and so on, compliance, those need to be a first-class part of software given how critical it is to our lives today. And then technical debts. The fact that these are a core part of software delivery that's often misunderstood and unplanned for. Technical debts, infrastructure debts, even debts with the value stream network itself, with how things are flowing. And these 4 flow items are mutually exclusive and comprehensively exhaustive. And this is the key thing. So they're MECE. You do more of one, you do less of the other. You just ask your teams to implement a bunch of GDPR changes, they're going to do fewer features, and they will take on more debts. And it's those equations, it's that zero-sum game that's so critical to understand at the business level. So for any new product or any innovation you want to bring into your existing product, the success of that product will tend to be dominated by the number of features you deliver. That's what will make it competitive. That's what will make someone choose your mobile application, your booking application, your customer experience over another one. As that's happening, debts and risks rise. So developers, infrastructure, operations, they're taking shortcuts to get to market, to get you as successful as possible, as quickly as possible. As that's happening, quality is going down, because as debts and risks rise, quality goes down. And defect work goes up and up and up. And I've actually personally been here more times than I care to admit. the value stream gets into this death spiral, or worse yet, the organization gets into this death spiral, as we saw with Nokia. Defect work starts taking all of the capacity of that product value stream, and feature work goes down to zero. And that's where Nokia found itself. And that's where many companies have found themselves, where they just simply could not keep up with the debt that had accumulated over the platform from all those feature pushes. Now, I'll give you an example of an organization that actually understood this dynamic. And this is Microsoft, and this is Bill Gates, back in 2003, releasing this fascinating memo that blew my mind when I first read it. And this was the Trustworthy Computing Memo. So what Bill Gates said is that to Microsoft, in this, what was it, I don't think it was intended to be a private memo, but that security was a really big issue, and that there was a problem with Microsoft security and trust practices. And the Trustworthy Computing Memo said, we're going to shift focus from doing feature work to doing security and debt reduction, right? And this is a time where Microsoft is, of course, has many competitors going after it. And somehow, this CEO of the company said, we're going to stop feature work, which I think no enterprise IT company CEO has ever said, right? You just want faster time to market. You want to get more done quickly. So feature work at Microsoft goes down to effectively zero for almost a year. And debt work and trustworthy computing and Windows Update happens. Now, keep in mind, by the way, that a lot of us worry about the legacy of the code in our organizations. Microsoft effectively started the age of software, right? Microsoft and Intel. They have more legacy, I think, than anybody on the planet as a result of that. So this massive software portfolio is now getting this tech debt reduction investment. They can't replatform it, right? They can't do what Twitter did and restart the whole thing. And debts and risks go down. And the bottom line is, at the end of this, they're going faster than ever. They've now created the most valuable software portfolio and the most valuable public company on the planet by understanding these trade-offs and investing accordingly. Other companies, other tech giants have been through these kinds of waves. eBay, Google, Google had to completely change its test practices through its automated testing. Twitter's replatformed multiple times. So there have been different versions of this. But with the tech companies, what's happened is that with the tech giants, each of their CEOs was actually a software developer. Even Bezos was a software developer at one point. And they understand these kinds of trade-offs. So the question to me became, how do we, to today's business leaders, how do we make those trade-offs visible and explicit? Because, of course, we'll make the right decisions if we're presented with the right information. And that's really the goal of the Flow framework. So what the Flow framework does is it has you basically define and create product value streams. You might have to keep some of your project management practices in place. Project management is actually good for some things like launching new offerings and products and so on. But you define your product value streams, and for each you set a flow distribution. So if this thing is meant to be an innovative, new mobile experience, you better have a fast feature flow. And you probably want to go cloud native because there's no other way to get that rate of feature flow and feedback, which are, again, obviously the core principles of DevOps and the continual learning that comes from it, other than through a cloud-native infrastructure. If this is an older, more legacy value stream, right, you actually might be able to focus that value stream not on fast feature flow, but on risk and debt reduction. And that's OK. Maybe you don't containerize that thing. Maybe you leave it and you strangle it out over time. And then for each, you track these flow metrics. And I'll tell you about each of the flow metrics in a moment, and you correlate them to business results. So for each product value stream, you have the business results defined. You have a value result, such as revenue, such as conversions, such as, if it's an internal product value stream, the API adoption of that particular API. You have a cost metric, but the cost is across the value stream. It'll actually even include, for us, the hosting cost of that particular product, a quality metric, and a happiness metric of the staff working on that product value stream. Because what we noticed is that, say with Nokia, the staff working on the Symbian operating system were miserable. They wanted to make the company succeed, but they were never given a chance. It would have been a very good early warning indicator had Nokia noticed this. When we, for us measuring employee net promoter score, our happiness metric at Tasktop, not just for departments, but for product value streams, has been invaluable. We see where we actually have the architectural problems based on that kind of feedback. So the flow metrics that you measure are flow velocity, how much of each flow item gets done, flow efficiency, how much it's actively being worked on versus waiting for 8 people to join a meeting to approve it and so on, or waiting on some UX or security review. Flow time, how long it takes to get that to market. But these are all end-to-end metrics. And then flow load. So how much load you've put on your product value streams. Because as it turns out, if you overload a value stream, we tend to want to, as of the last decade, I've spent more on the business side, load them up to 100%. We've already seen metrics from our customers that once you start going over 80, 90%, you get less out, not more, which is exactly what happened in manufacturing. Your robots are at capacity, you're getting fewer cars out, not more. So I'll now give you an example. And this is the example of one of our customers, Nationwide Insurance, where we actually measured across their portfolio of 200 product lines. It's a large insurance company, or mid-sized, 9,000 IT staff. And looked at how long does it take to get value, end-to-end time, not code commit to code deploy, not user story open to user story close, customer's perspective, business partner's perspective of value, how long it takes end-to-end. And it took 120 days. So the CIO was not thrilled with 120 days. It sounds like it's too long. We can do better. This is 3 or 4 years ago, by the way. And so, of course, let's hire more developers. And then we showed some additional information through this by actually looking at what that 120 days was composed of. And 2.5% of the time was spent in development. So you hire more developers. This is just like the Nokia scenario. You hire more developers, you hire double the developers, and you're getting nothing more out. Because only 2.5% of the time is in development. Development is not the constraint. So this is the point of measuring flow time, is you're not measuring a local part of the value stream, you're measuring end to end. And you're looking for bottlenecks. You're looking where to invest. In the case of Nationwide Insurance, there were slightly different bottlenecks in different parts of the software portfolio. Right? The one that we looked at most closely, because it had to do with their transformation, was the customer-facing insurance products, where they had mobile and web experiences. And there was this interesting thing that we noticed, is that developers were waiting on designers, because, of course, they want to have very slick user experiences and screens. So you actually look at this, and we looked at, OK, well, some of our customers we've noticed, they'll have one designer for 100 developers. Companies with great user experiences have like 1 to 10. So this is some examples, like Atlassian, Box, IBM, and so on. They've seen this as a bottleneck. They invest here. For some value streams, this might be the case. Another value stream, the bottleneck might be in some security approval process or something of that sort. But until you start measuring this, again, as an end-to-end flow, rather than tracking projects, you actually don't see it. You can't invest in the right way. And that's the whole point of flow efficiency. Why is delivery slowing as we add more developers? The key thing that we're seeing in terms of this way of tracking, again, the flow metrics, is that the software architecture is misaligned to the value streams. Because the value streams were never defined, and the software architecture never had a chance to be aligned to those product value streams. So by defining these product value streams, tracking the flow efficiency, you see where the wait states are. You see that all these developers are waiting on an API. You see that they're waiting on some data representation of the customer that was supposed to come 3 months ago. And then you invest accordingly, rather than putting all your best resources, all your best people on the business-facing things. You actually start investing lower down in your shared services and platforms. And that's what you'll see in the successful tech companies. Their investment, the lower down you go into their stack, because there's the business applications, there's the internal shared services and platforms and APIs, and there's the tool chain itself. The lower you go, the more investment they have at the bottom. Whereas traditional businesses, they put the best stuff at the top. Microsoft itself has 3,500 developers working on its developer tools. Oh, sorry, 3,500 staff. The majority of whom are developers. So that's the point of tracking flow velocity. You start seeing these things. And again, you start seeing where the bottlenecks are and where you invest. Why are the teams working on this product less happy? All too often, it's technical debt is causing overly high flow load. They're thrashing on those features. They're not getting this done. So the whole point here is that you start connecting these product value streams. You start seeing end-to-end. This is how we do it. At my company, at TaskStop, our work enters in Salesforce. That's where our customer requests are. That's where our tickets are. Then it goes into our road mapping tool. Then the work gets done in Jira, then gets deployed. And the thing is that once you start seeing these flow metrics, so this is how we look at them, I can actually see that when we had an overly high flow load, our flow velocity, this happened in April when we had a first release of this particular product of TaskStop Viz, our flow time got almost 10x worse. So even even though we think we like to understand these concepts at TaskStop, I like to think we understand them, this will still happen, right? Everyone will want to finish those features. The backlog gets too big. The team starts working on too much at once. And we get a 10th out at the end, right? But the difference for us is this is visible. We saw this, the next sprint. We saw it basically almost right away, so we could adjust and give those teams a chance to invest in the right things. Same with tech debt. We see the proportion of work on tech debt. We see if it's getting too low. Well, that could be a problem because we'll have to pay that down later. If it's getting too high, maybe it's time for to really change the architecture over here. So the whole goal here, and I'll wrap up now, is that we go away from this agile in the middle, DevOps in the middle mindset, and the rest of the organization being waterfall, to this flow-oriented mindset across the organization by agreeing on how we measure productivity, how we measure flow. You go away from visibility having this layer of indirection, where you're always getting this false sense of security at business level that things are on track when they aren't. And you actually start getting direct visibility. You start seeing that tech debt climbing month after month, and you know that there might be a problem. And that people are being over-optimistic. You also see if you make a big architecture investment, you better see a payback in feature flow. Because why invest in any architecture work if you're not going to get more features to your customers in the end? And you start thinking differently about budgets. You start, rather than baking in all those risks up front, you actually start thinking about budgets more incrementally. For example, we will have an annual budget that goes to our board, but every quarter, we look across our product value streams, and we'll actually start looking at making business decisions around that. So we will move teams between product value streams when we see more benefit over here and more results. And the key thing is you start thinking of your people, again, as giving them that chance, that autonomy. You give each value stream its autonomy. Rather than bringing people to work, you bring work to people. So we, for example, and I strongly recommend this, never assign a person to more than one product value stream. The work they do is complex. It takes them a while to master that work with their team. And by allowing them that chance to do that and only focus on one thing, we actually see much more flow velocity as a result. So, and I already mentioned the architecture. This allows you to look at where you make these investments in your value streams. So in summary, today's IT practices and this notion of project management as the managerial principle and of only tracking cost centers won't help your company survive the turning point. The shift from project to product needs to happen at an organization level. It's a new operating model. It's a new way of looking and investing at your IT portfolio, at your product portfolio. And the catalyst that we see to that is just starting to look at, again, these end-to-end flow metrics. And you'll still, again, you'll use agile metrics, you'll use burn up and burn down charts, you'll count your deploys per day, but you'll manage towards the end-to-end flow. So for more, you can get the book at, ironically, Amazon. And everywhere else. You can get here, actually, you don't need to go on Amazon because Deborah's got them all for you here, which is great. The Flow Frameworks at flowframework.org are commercial solutions to help you on your journey. You can get from tasktop.com or just contact me at that email address. And with that, thank you.